Hi, everyone. This is Seth Itzkan here with Soil4Climate, and I'm here with Ridge Shinn, my mentor and friend in this area, and I'm happy to say that Ridge is now on the Soil4Climate Advisory Board. Thank you, Ridge, for joining. We're really happy to have you.
Pleased to be here.
And today's interview with Ridge concerns his company, Big Picture Beef, and they do have a big picture for how they want to change the world. And one of the ways they want to change the world, according to Ridge, is he says, give me Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, and I'll clean up the Mississippi, the floods in the Mississippi. I'll fix the American obesity problem, and I'll help change the weather for the better, help mitigate global warming. So thank you, Ridge. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
And
here.
And hello, all Soil4Climate Facebook friends. And so, Ridge, why don't you take it away? Just talk a little bit about Big Picture Beef and what's your big picture for Big Picture Beef.
Sure. Well, the big picture is that what we know is that if we graze cattle correctly, we sequester large amounts of carbon, we fix the water cycle, and we create jobs. Kind of how I get to it, I tell people, so if you imagine the old prairie, so how do you imagine the old prairie? Do you imagine the grass growing and then the buffalo parachuted in? Or the buffalo milling around on a dry lot and the prairie parachuted in? In reality, it was a synergistic relationship of the large herbivores with the ground, the microbes, the grass, the sun, that created those deep soils that we all know were excellent storage spots for carbon. And now our current research is showing that when we graze using this adaptive multipaddock grazing methodology, that we sequester significant amounts of carbon. The carbon in the ground then absorbs water and slow releases it back into the environment. So all of those big goals are quite achievable. Keeping the water out of the Mississippi, keeping the rainwater out of the Mississippi, and grabbing it in the soil, slow releasing it back, which will impact the climate, the weather. And if we do it with a large herd of beef cattle, we'll have a tremendous amount of excellent protein, which will address obesity.
Now, Ridge, talk for a minute about your actual vision of Big Picture Beef. Like how's that going to work? How are you going to source it and finish it and whatever? And while you do, I actually have to go close some windows because there's some background noise coming in.
Okay.
So all right. My buddy Carl will do it.
Big Picture Beef is a company selling grass-fed beef into the markets in the Northeast at the moment. So our geographic spread is to Northeast as designated by the USDA. So it includes New England, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. And in those states, there's over 600,000 beef cattle born every year. Not dairy cattle, beef cattle. 90% of those cattle end up being aggregated by the cattle dealers and going west to the feedlots. They go get backgrounded and end up on the feedlot. So our model is to insert ourselves in that movement of cattle. Instead of the cattle, the feeder calves, a year of age, moving west, we aggregate them and put them on our finishing farms, which is a grass forage only finishing farm in the Northeast. We have 6 of them, and we aggregate a big herd, and by moving them 3 or 4 times a day, we can actually finish them, make them fat on grass efficiently, harvest them in the Northeast, bring them into the Northeast market. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of Big Picture Beef. So it's an aggregation from a whole bunch of small family farms where the cattle are born and moving them to a finishing operation that's grass-only finishing, harvesting in the Northeast.
So, Ridge, let's take like New York City, for example. Mm-hmm. What's the current way in which steaks basically get to New York, and how are you going to change that, and what will be the impacts?
Okay, well, basically, if you look at grass-fed beef, 100% grass-fed beef, the marketplace has already embraced it. Today, the market is about $4 billion worth of grass-fed beef consumed. That's on the whole country, but great majority of it is on the east and west coast. 85% of that meat comes from Australia and New Zealand and Uruguay. So it's a $4 billion market, and about $1 billion is produced in the USA. The rest of it's foreign, and most people can't differentiate with the packaging, because it's true that you can bring product from another country like Uruguay, bring it into Massachusetts, cut it up, process it, package it, and write right on the package, produced in the USA. So it's a real misnomer, but so that's a big job, is to get people to understand that they should buy product that's actually raised in the USA as well as processed in the USA. So that's kind of, I mean, that's the big job, is to educate people about grass-fed beef and where it comes from. And then it's to get it into the markets, it's a huge logistical scenario. I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're using existing distributors, existing stores, existing people to move the product to market. So you go into the store and you'll be able to see it right there in the meat case. You don't have to go to the farmer's market to get it. You don't have to do anything kind of out of the ordinary. You just have to walk by with your basket and pick it up. So that's our goal.
So you're saying that there's product called grass-fed beef that's being marketed in New York and Boston and all over the Northeast. And it may even say product of the United States, but it's actually not from the United States, right, although it is technically grass-fed.
Right. It could very well be 100% grass-fed, never eat anything but grass. But like I said, the great majority of it today is coming from Australia, Uruguay, and New Zealand, and now Ireland is bringing in beef. And the labeling is very confusing. So the customer, it's hard for the customer to sort out. But that's our job, is to try and help people understand where it's produced. Because in reality, if it's produced in the USA, then it can have impact on jobs, carbon here, and the water cycle here. If it's produced in Australia, it might have some of those impacts for Australia, but it certainly doesn't have them for our region. Okay,
I want to talk about the impacts in the United States in a second. If you're watching this, please share to various groups. In fact, Carl, our trusted technician and intellectual workhorse here, Carl, please feel free to share this stream wherever you can. And folks, if you have questions, just ask a question directly into the comment area here on the video stream. Okay. Oh, hi, Ed. We see you. Thank you, Ed. Please feel free to share this. So that's a really good point. So you can get grass-fed beef here, but if it's not actually produced here, then we're not getting the environmental benefits of
Absolutely.
that. Okay. Absolutely. All right. So let's talk for a second about the environmental benefits of producing grass-fed beef in America. Go ahead, say something about that.
Okay. Well, I mean, like, as I said, we've the research now is showing very clearly that if we graze correctly, it's not just grass-fed beef, but it's grass-fed beef grazed according to the adaptive multi-paddock grazing methodology. So the cattle are moved like a big herd of buffalo. You can imagine a big herd of 50,000 animals. When they move through an area of grass, it's totally trampled, manure, urine, and they move on, and the ground rests. So we are trying to mimic that. You've heard the term biomimicry. We're trying to mimic that methodology of moving the cattle and resting the land. When you do that, it turns out that the land is very porous. If you go to our website, you'll see a perk test showing how ground perks if it's corn land, or if it's extensively grazed, like most of the land in the West is grazed, or if it's this adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And it's remarkable. The corn land takes 30 minutes for the water to percolate. That's why we have flooding in the Mississippi, because the ground in a corn land is like concrete. and the rain rains, and it goes downhill and it heads to the river. On the extensively grazed land, it's much better. It takes only 7 minutes to percolate. When you move over to the piece of land where they've been doing this adaptive multi-paddock grazing, it takes 10 seconds to percolate. So the difference between 30 minutes and 10 seconds is just stunning, and that gets the water out of the air into the ground. If you graze correctly, you've sequestered a tremendous amount of carbon way below the soil, not on the surface, and that carbon absorbs many, many times its weight in water, and now you have a stable, essentially a sponge that's holding the water and slow releasing it back into the environment in your normal water cycle.
So what do we know about the flooding in the Mississippi? And let's talk about those states, particularly, what do we say, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. Okay, right. That was sort of the pitch for this thing, give me Iowa and I'll change the weather.
Right.
So let's just talk about those three states. And also let me say to people watching, there are graphics that we put in the event, in the comment area of the event post for this on Facebook that show a map of the United States. It showed two maps. One shows the concentration of what's called animal food versus human food. Basically, they're talking about soy and corn for CAFOs. And the other map shows crop insurance. And it's fascinating to see those two maps next to each other. But really, if you look at Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, it's almost 100% corn and soy and products for animals, and it should all be tall grass prairie. It's really remarkable what we've done with the best soils in the world. So talk about those three states particularly, and how your plan will sort of short circuit the damage that's going on there.
Well, if you look at those three states, as Seth just said, you look at the map, it's 95 to 100% corn and soy. So there's a few cattle there, but the great majority of those land is planted to corn and soy. A number of years ago, I drove through that whole area all day, 12 hours. And as I drove, I began to think something's weird here. I don't really understand. And then it finally dawned on me that on the highway, the interstate, the median strip was all green and the guys were out there mowing it. And there was a fence on the side of the road and there was a little strip of green and the guys were mowing that. Across the fence was the corn land that hadn't been planted to corn yet that year. And I drove 10 hours, 12 hours. I don't remember how long, a long time. And finally it dawned on me that there were no weeds growing all day long. So here is our best, most fertile soils, and weeds won't grow because of the compaction and the poisons and on and on. If you go to Boston or Manhattan, the weeds come up through the pavement. But here's our agricultural land and the weeds won't grow. So that's the situation we're in. So where do all those crops go? 40% of those crops go to the CAFO feedlots. So we harvest them, put them on a truck and drive them to somewhere else, concentrate all the manures, the nutrients, so to speak, concentrate them all at the CAFOs. The other 40% goes to ethanol, which, I don't want to spend all the time talking about that, but that's another insanity. And if we could take those lands back, what we know from having grazed land that was in corn is in probably 2 to 3 years, we could recreate very fertile grasslands there on those soils. The ground wants to be grassland. Given half a chance, the microbes will return. The deep soils will begin to grow again. And we can do it very quickly on those, particularly on those very fertile soils.
And these are soils that used to be tall grass prairie.
Right.
This used to be the best soil in the world, right?
Right.
I'm going to just move
basically, the corn and soy methodology that we use has been harvesting carbon for years and years and years. When you plow, the carbon oxidizes and goes up in the air and becomes CO2. So if we put it back to grass, then we have the phenomenal solar collector, which is a plant, which uses photosynthesis to grab the CO2, change it into sugars and stable carbon, puts it down below the soil in a safe place where it can't reoxidize. So it's this incredible cycle. So to make that change requires a huge paradigm shift. And I feel like the customer, the people, the eaters, the people who buy meat, if they could understand this, they could impact that paradigm shift. But it's a huge paradigm shift.
Right, absolutely. Again, if you have questions, please just type the question in the comment area. Carl, you're monitoring that? Okay, and feel free to share to different groups. Okay, all right. We have a question coming in from Ed. Um, Guys like Dick Thompson and the Practical Farmers of Iowa are trying to do some decent things, at least in a transition. Thank you. Are you familiar with what they're doing?
No, I assume what he's talking about is transitioning to cover crops, cocktail cover crops, because that is absolutely the transition from bare cornland to return to a perennial climate.
Right, and that transitional thing is important. That's kind of where policy comes in. Soil4Climate is involved in policy, and there are healthy soils legislation bills of various sorts going on right now. Ed, feel free to sort of join us through, through the text window here if you want to add. Ridge assumed what you're talking about is the cocktail cover crops, but this whole transitioning of the soy, corn industry to basically returning to grasslands and to grazing is obviously it's the major issue before us in terms of American land management and in terms of food, and all that. And so, like, realistically, how is that going to happen? There's going to have to be some sort of transitional money involved. This is where the healthy soils legislation comes in. There's carbon markets. There's the Green Climate Fund. There's re-education for farmers. I mean, but basically the most important thing, as Rich keeps saying, is we need demand for American grass-fed, grass-finished beef.
Right.
Okay, I just want to change this again so that you're more in the middle. Sorry.
Yeah, so the
Just trying to do the
pull on the rope is really the major thing. So we here in the Northeast, we have the dairy farmers are in desperate situations. So in February, Agrimark, which is the big dairy co-op that buys most of the milk, when they sent the milk checks in February, they also sent letters with names of suicide prevention counselors. So it's a desperate situation, and the corn and soy farmers are in the same boat. The price is depressed. Nobody's really making a killing here, and they're desperate for a way out. And the grass-fed beef, my speculation is that the grass-fed beef could be a way out. Forbes is predicting that the grass-fed beef business will become a $30 billion business within the next 6 to 8 years. That's 30% of the total beef consumed. Part of that is figuring out that it needs to be USA beef that makes up that $30 billion. It's a lot of money. And that economic driver could change those prairies. And the way to do it, I'm not sure if that's what Ed was talking about, but one thing we have learned a whole lot about is what we call cocktail cover crops. So you could take a bare piece of corn land that's been sprayed with glyphosate, GMO corn, years and years and years, as it is, and you could plant a cocktail cover crop, meaning an 8, 12 species of grasses, legumes, forbs, radishes, chicory, all kinds of things. And that cover crop, when it's planted, will be deep rooted, will break that concrete like soil. And guess what? If we graze cattle on that cover crop, we can achieve gains that are equivalent to feedlot gains. We can gain 3+ pounds of gain per day on those cover crops. So, it's a tremendous opportunity. And if we manage the cattle correctly, trample a bunch of that cover crop back into the soil, and we build that organic carbon micro-rich soil rapidly. And we've done this around the country. Gabe Brown, of course, is a leader. Search Gabe Brown if you want to know more about that. We've done it in North Carolina on burnt out tobacco land. I mean, you have all this land that's been burnt out by the extractive agricultural practices that can be returned to health rapidly by this methodology of cover crops. And cover crops linked with livestock. So Gabe Brown was a pioneer in these cocktail cover crops. What he found is the cover crops increased the carbon, but then when he added livestock to the mix, the line became pretty much vertical. So still the people that are in this business are learning rapidly about how fast we can build carbon with the livestock linked with cover crops and perennial grasses.
Excellent. And Rick has just said the cover crops are the key to reclaiming old cropland. Absolutely. Please, folks, ask a question through the text box for the comment area on the video. I see them coming up, and we'll read them. So again, I'm Seth Itzkan with Soil4Climate, with Ridge Shinn, the proprietor of Big Picture Beef, and also now a Soil4Climate Advisory Board member. And the vision of Big Picture Beef, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is to serve the Northeast. Let's just say, like from Washington to Bangor, and to have the meat be 100% grass-fed, grass-finished here in the Northeast. So this massive movement of animals to the CAFOs in the Midwest, where they're fattened and slaughtered and then moved back as product to the markets in New York and Boston. We just completely short-circuit that. And so there's a lot of riverways and flatlands in New England and New York and in the Northeast, which are suffering, which can also benefit from proper grazing. But we're also, short-circuiting the flow to the CAFOs. So we're undermining the whole CAFO operation. And it's just brilliant vision. And, and then of course there's a question, well, what's going to happen to CAFOs, and how are we going to do that transition in the Midwest, away from the market demand that the farmers there have to satisfy what the CAFOs are calling for. And this is where legislation and consumer awareness comes in. I mean, this is a major deal, people, obviously. I mean, we're basically talking about the middle part of the United States, what was some of the best land in the world has been converted to factory farming of grain for animals, and it's absurd. It should be grass, it should be grazed. So how are we going to do that? So we have some good comments coming in here. Animal spreading, microbial diversity on all soil is crucial to getting soil functioning again. Cover crops, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ed. Rick writes oats and fall rye. Excellent results here in Ontario. Oh, Rick, okay, I didn't realize you were in Ontario. Hoping Ontario will follow. How will grazing Iowa change the weather? Right. That was the money question. Thank you, Natalie, for asking it.
Perfect. Yeah, okay. There we go.
Thank you. So the time is 12:09. We're about to answer the money question. How does
so how it impacts weather is rain rains. If the rain is therefore captured on the piece of land that it rains on, which it can be if there's carbon in the soil, then it slow releases back. As I was telling Seth earlier, I have a farm in Massachusetts that I've leased, and during when we get a drought, we only have 20 inches of rain. So you never in Iowa get 20 inches of rain, but it was a droughty year, and we were all the farms around are complaining about a drought. And in my grass that was 4 feet tall, I would walk through that grass and I could come out wet. So we had a totally different microclimate because of the grass, because of the microbes, because of the whole situation. And that, because the water penetrated the soil and is slow released, if you could do that on a landscape scale, like the whole state of Iowa, believe me, it would have an impact on the water cycle, the weather, and the drought. And because what's happening now is all that land, those 3 states that we talk about, when it rains, it takes 30 minutes for that water to penetrate the soil. So it goes to the river. None of it's captured. And if it's not captured, it can't go back into the normal water cycle of transpiration, rain, healing the drought. So that's I don't know if that explained it clearly, but that's the possibility.
And thank you for asking that question, Natalie. Let me jump in here with an answer on that too, because we're Soil4Climate, right? So part of our whole advocacy is that changing soil can change the climate, and the climate is the weather. So we use the term climate and weather, a little bit interchangeably there. But so Natalie and everyone else who's listening, think about it like this: just go bring up a map of the United States. And, look at where Iowa is, right? And then of course Illinois, Indiana. You're basically looking at areas that were tall grass prairie that was literally some of the healthiest soil in the world left over from the last ice age, right? I mean, they're just south of the Great Lakes, which is geological residual of the last ice ages, and I mean, that whole area is what we might call bottomlands, the best soils in the world. And the amount of carbon in those soils was, huge amount of carbon.
Well, you can measure it in feet.
Yeah. It was like something like 10 feet of topsoil, right? Yeah, something like 10 feet. We're not talking, these days when they talk about topsoil, they're talking like what, 8 to 15 inches at max. These were like 3 meters of topsoil. And that's all, that's carbon. And that's also impacting the water cycle, it's impacting the clouds, it's literally impacting the weather. But now if you expand it even more, it's not just Iowa, of course, it's that whole region, that whole central part of the United States. Well, what's going above it is the jet streams. And the weather basically goes west to east. We're in the Boston area right now. And it's not just a matter of carbon in the soil, which impacts what's called the forcing, the temperature forcing on the planet from the sun's light, because the CO2, reflects the sunlight. That's the greenhouse effect. But it's not just that. It's the fact of ground that is has biomass on it that's transpiring water versus ground which is just dirt and getting really hot and baked in the sun. And there's literally a temperature difference, a significant temperature difference. I mean, you can feel it yourself. If on a hot day, if you're on your driveway and then you walk into the meadow, and it's significant. I mean, it's like a 20, 30, 40 degree difference just right there, just by your house, between being in the meadow and being on the driveway. Well, imagine all of that for the middle of the United States, right? Imagine, it's all just brown, it's all been plowed, and it's literally just baking. It's literally heating up the atmosphere above it. And yes, in fact, that absolutely changes the weather, because now you have weather patterns forming over it. You have the jet streams forming over it. You have all this hot air coming up. And so, in fact, you really do change the weather by changing the biology on the land over a large area of the landscape. Okay, so Natalie, we hope that answered that question.
Someone's asking about cover crops in the heavy clay soils.
So, yeah, please answer any questions.
Yeah, one of the things in the mix of cover crops tends to be radishes, daikon radishes, which are like 16 inches long radishes. The other is chicory with a long taproot. So there are a number of plants that will drill into that heavy clay soil and get below the plow pan that's been there from plowing or any of the tilling that's been done. There's a lot of research done on that, but there's actually a guy named Rick Haney who works for the U.S. government. He's out of Texas, and he has developed something called the Haney soil test. So you could send him a soil test, and he could then turn around and recommend a cover crop mix specifically suited to your soil type. And, so this cover crop, cocktail cover crop business is just beginning to go. But there's a lot of mainline practitioners. Dave Brandt is one that's done a lot of research in Ohio, Gabe Brown, Rick Haney. So there's a lot of information out there that you can access to find out, what to start with as a cover crop. In reality, any mix, the more species, the better, is what the research is showing. So the more diversity, the better. You're pulling nutrients and all from different soil levels. You're pulling moisture from different soil levels if you have a multi-species mix.
And the market demand on that, again, is going to be for U.S. Started and finished grass-fed beef.
Absolutely.
I mean that's the market demand,
right,
that's going to necessitate doing the cover crops and the conversion, and also more awareness of the environmental benefits of doing that. So we're at 12:16 now. Ridge can go for another 14 minutes or so total. So please, folks, continue to share this while we're live, so we can get questions. Could you spell his last name? Shinn.
Shinn.
Shinn. There you go.
Yeah, and
Ridgway F Shinn.
And go visit our website. There's a lot of good data on that. This website is big picture beef.
Big.
But there's a lot of links to research and in all these areas. So it's well worth a little bit of time if you have an inclination, if you have an interest. But the there's the brand. But the our model is we're starting in the Northeast, but we really want anybody who wants to steal our concept and take it national. I mean, I think the concept of aggregation of small family farms to the market is the answer, because what happens is when you have one farmer trying to access a market, like for instance, when I called Harvard University and said, hey, I've got 100% grass-fed beef, locally produced, they kind of laughed. And they said, well, we use 23,000 pounds of ground beef a year. And I said, fine, talk to me. I've got all these farmers working with me. 23,000 pounds is not a big blip. And that's the big markets want a significant volume, and they want it every week consistently. And the only way to do that is if farmers get together and aggregate in order to create a large volume of a consistent quality product.
So who was it? Sorry, who was it that said they wanted 23,000 pounds?
Harvard University.
A week.
No.
Okay. Okay, hear that, folks? Harvard University, the bastion of intellectual activity.
Well, we sell to Smith College now, and there's some universities that have moved very rapidly. Like Yale is selling 100% grass-fed beef from Australia, so that's a problem, and that's a problem that the students need to get a hold of, because if it's coming from Australia, that's better than Capo beef, absolutely, hands down. But there's a potential to pull it from the U.S. will have these kind of impacts on what people call the externalities: soil, carbon, water, and jobs. Those are the externalities that we kind of ignore when we import, from Australia and Europe.
Okay, so a couple of good points there. One is that there are markets like universities or big institutions that are going to say, okay, we're going to need 23,000 pounds per year. That's a good data item to know. And the other is that they think they're doing a good thing by getting grass-fed meat, but it's coming from Uruguay. And so let's say, yes, it is a good thing because it is grass-fed. It's not coming from CAFOs. But still, it's not American, bred and finished meats. And so we're not having the environmental or the market benefits in the United States. So we need both those things. Ridge is available to talk about his business and the business side of it. I'm available to talk about sort of the climate and the legislative side of this, because we're doing more and more stuff with policy. So if you know people at institutions, Harvard, Yale, or whoever, who kind of want to, hear this pitch from both sides, Ridge and I are happy to talk to them. We do have another question here. How do sheep handle cover crop cocktails?
They'll do fine. I mean, sheep are ruminants. They'll do fine. The big challenges with sheep are only that they predators, but they'll work just as well. So what happens is, like with the cattle, when you have a cover crop, the grasses, some of the grasses get to be 6 or 7 feet tall, way over the animals' heads. But they go in and eat, and I could show you a video. I think we might have a video on our website. They eat, and they trample. So they are acting. The cattle are much bigger, but the sheep is the same situation to a smaller degree. They'll eat what they can reach. They'll trample some if they're concentrated enough. The thing is, the cattle and or sheep need to be concentrated. They need to be put, managed with a fence to be in a fairly tight group. Actually, it's interesting because our concentration of animals is probably tighter in the grass-fed situation than it is on the feedlot. The main difference is on the feedlot, they stand in that pen for 120 days. In our case, they're close together, but they move every 3 or 4 times a day. And cattle actually like to be together. They don't like to be standing in manure for 120 days. But they love being in a herd. They love being together. That's how they prefer to be. And so we kind of optimize that, but also make sure that there's something for them to eat. So with the sheep, it's pretty much the same scenario. You probably choose lower growing cover crops for that cocktail cover crop, but there's so many options for the cocktail cover crops.
Okay, so sheep do okay with cover crops. So we really only have 9 minutes left. So if you have a question, please ask it right now in the comment section of the video here. Send in the cows and follow with sheep, maximize. Yes, absolutely.
That works too.
Absolutely. Ed and thanks. Ed and Rick, we love you guys. Let's get a couple more questions while Ridge is here live. There is also, of course, the issue of verification, right? We need to verify, the soil carbon is increasing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think verification is great. And now there's all kinds of certification bodies growing, being developed. I mean, the Shaver Institute's developing their brand, and there's all these different certifications, which are great. And it really is very important to measure the carbon in the soil. But that said, if I walk into a field and I see grass that's 2 to 3 feet tall, I know that the roots are down there 2 to 3 feet deep. I know that my solar collector is grabbing CO2 and putting it down safely below the soil, and therefore I'm gathering carbon, and it would be nice to measure it, but if I can see what's growing, and I can determine that there is carbon being sequestered. And this is one of my big bugaboos on a lot of grass-fed beef. You see a picture on a website, and the cattle are standing in a golf course, and if the cattle are standing in a golf course, there's no grass, and if there's no grass, there's no roots. Because what we know is that if you clip the top if you clip grass above soil, you slough off the roots below soil. But when you trample the grass, when you lay it down, you don't cut off the roots. But that's why you need tall grass. You need grass that's grown fairly good size. And what we know in terms of finishing is that the grass, in the grass itself, in the top part of the grass is where the energy resides. And then there's protein and lignin. But the grass, in the top of the grass, and the cattle understand that. So if you put cattle into a new paddock, if you stand back and watch what they do, they will go top all the grass. So they will take all the cream first. Then they'll go back for another bite and another bite. So if we're wanting to finish, if we're wanting to add energy to their diet, we have to move them so they have grass available at all times, kind of like the buffalo moving steadily across the prairie.
And just a couple other points I want to say about verification. I just tagged Dee Dee Piercehouse on in the comment area. Dee Dee and Peter Donovan have been going around the country doing what they're calling a land listening workshops, which is a brilliant name. And then there's something called the Soil Carbon Coalition, which is basically training people how to take their own soil carbon tests, and sort of an open source, public domain type of way of sharing information about soil carbon on your property. And I think that's fantastic. That type of sort of grassroots revolution, if you will, in measuring soil carbon is absolutely the way to go. And there are maps. Check out Soil Carbon Coalition, and he has something called the Soil Carbon Atlas. Of course, there's all sorts of USDA, sort of official websites with soil carbon maps too. But this is a practitioner-driven effort. So showing people how to measure their own soil carbon and upload it, and it is an interesting issue there about, well, do you really even need to measure it? I mean, you can look at a field and you can see that it is much better. But yes, that's the world that we're in now, is sort of the accounting.
You do need the peer review.
Yeah, and we definitely advocate for, peer review, scientifically verified accounting of carbon drawdown, because there's going to be credits and all that stuff. But we also need to make the case, the efficacy of this effort, that yes, this is a climate effort. So
the other person to search for peer-reviewed research is Richard Teague.
Absolutely, yeah.
Texas A&M.
Yeah.
And Richard has done quite a bit of research in Texas, Missouri, and Canada. He's just been given $2.5 million by the government of Canada to continue the research, and just recently been given $6 million by McDonald's Corporation to continue the research. So there's a lot of people that are saying, wait a second, this methodology of grazing actually sequesters carbon fairly rapidly. And if we could scale this, it would make a huge, huge difference.
Okay, so just a couple more minutes left. I know you want to be really out the door by 12:30.
Yeah, right? I'm sorry, I've cross-scheduled some things. And
okay.
But this is...
okay, all right, no worries. Well, then let's just make closing comments. Any last words?
No, well, yeah, the last words are Wendell Berry's. My favorite quote from Wendell Berry is, "Eating is an agricultural act." So the choice you make on which beef you buy is either supporting the CAFO or supporting carbon drawdown. And that's it's a choice that the customers, I think, it's a very complicated topic, but once they get it, I think that can happen very rapidly. The example I use is pink slime. I don't know if you have all heard of pink slime, but that's something that the last part of the process, they use ammonia to take the little drippings off the bones, and they were putting that in the school lunch program. And one mother found out about that, Bettina Siegel. She got on Facebook, and in 3 weeks, she put the USDA on the map. And the USDA said, no, we won't put it in the school lunch program anymore. But the consumers are extremely powerful. I know Seth is big on policy, but I still feel that the customers could understand this and pull on that rope. That reverberates through the rural economy. Every dollar that ends up at a farm gate reverberates through the local economy, creates jobs, not to mention carbon and water.
Right. Okay, well, Ridge, let me just say to you and to everyone else out there, Soil4Climate is here for you. I mean, that's the purpose of our nonprofit organization, is to be the advocacy front, if you will, for the science, practice, and policy of soil is a climate solution. Again, the science, the practice, and the policy of soil is a climate solution. The science, of course, is the peer review of the carbon in the soil, the health of the landscape, a variety of ecological functions. The practice, of course, is exactly what we're just talking about, the cover crops and doing the right type of grazing. And the policy, there's the healthy soils legislation. Just Google healthy soils legislation, whatever state or province you're in, there's probably some legislation that's moving its way through the process right now. Get involved in that and get involved with us, and so we can move this whole thing together. You heard the term adaptive multi-paddock grazing today. That term has sort of made its way into the academic literature, but the antecedent of that is, of course, holistic management or holistic planned grazing. So let's also give props to Alan Savory and the Savory Institute, and check out the Savory hubs, which are now opening, around the world in different places, because that's a good place to learn about both the grazing methodology and also the environmental indicators. At that, I think we should sum up. Feel free to share this video. Continue to ask questions in the discussion area, and Ridge is on Facebook. He'll answer when I can, and I'll get around to it. And please share Soil4Climate and Big Picture Beef.
Right.
Okay. So that's the big picture for Big Picture Beef. Okay. We're signing out. Okay. Good night, everyone. Bye bye.
Yeah. Right on time.
Right on time.